of you joining on live stream, you'll notice we have a different environment. We're downstairs in the church today. So we'll be starting in one. We'll give one more minute. Hello, Yvonne, who's on live stream. Hey, Billy, welcome. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Does someone want to open us up with prayer? And whoever, whenever, and I'll just say on both on the phone and here, because the camera's a little further away, if we could just be mindful of speaking up so that the camera can pick us up for the folks on live stream. So who wants to start us off?
Okay.
In prayer? Reverend Kathy?
Okay then. Gracious God, thank you. Thank you for this time. Thank you for this community and this gathering. I pray that you would continue to open our minds and open our hearts in you to hear and see and feel and experience your word and each other, and that we would all have the opportunity to share what's on our hearts. We pray in your many names. Amen.
You can sit
You
in
come
the
over here.
so that we're close to the camera. And
Please and thank you.
So, how did the reading go for everyone this week? Was it easy, hard?
It was
I
good.
was sharing with Lila that I'm still pulling up the rear a couple days behind, and at one point I had dropped really far behind, and I thought about just dropping the class, but then I realized I was too far invested, so I just double time read, and I almost caught up. And I also said that usually by Friday I'm so exhausted I don't want to read on a Friday, so the challenge is to continue to read on Friday despite how I might feel. But the reading itself went well for me anyway. That was my challenge.
Yeah, my challenge too is that after a bit of time, I feel like I'm not receiving the word, or I'm not, the words just sort of coming over each other. So I've actually, I used to just try to read the whole hour, 15 minutes at one time, but now I've broken them up, and I found that helps me out. I'll normally read at lunchtime, and then before I go to bed, and that seems to be helping me out a little bit with the reading.
Good. A couple of comments from the live stream viewers. Phil is on live stream. He said, reading went well. I love poor Job. And Yvonne said the reading went good. And A. Billy said it was somewhat easier, somewhat tedious.
Good.
Yeah. So let's dive right on in. So we did not really cover Esther last time. So tonight we're going to talk about Esther, Job, and Psalms up to the Psalms that we read through. We're not finished Psalms. But going back to Esther, I know it's been a week since we read Esther. But with Esther, there's a lot of interesting things going on in the story, and I'm racking my brain as to why, has there been like a Hollywood movie yet for Esther? I mean, it just, nothing comes, because it just seems like the perfect story, but what do people think about Esther?
Well, thank God for Esther and Ruth being the only two books dedicated to women in the Bible. Although, like you said, there's a lot going on in Esther. And I also feel as if Esther is just as much Mordecai's story as well. It's not totally her story, but it's an interesting, historical account, I guess, for the Jews. And also, when I read it, it came off, like you said, as more of a storyline, Hollywood, as opposed to the previous books, Nehemiah and Ezra, which have more of a historical bend to them, but lots of drama in Esther. So I agree with you on that.
People
But I
like,
also feel like it could have easily been the book of Mordecai.
right. Well, let's just dive right in terms of, like, how would you describe Esther? Who was she? What do you think she was like? How would you say, what would you say are some characteristics? Phil commented that he loves Esther. She's a strong woman. Love Esther.
Courageous.
Courageous.
She's blessed or privileged to have good advisors. The eunuch that advised her, Mordecai that advised her, the lessons that she learned perhaps from Vashti, Queen Vashti, which probably went throughout the land, at least so.
And she
I
lives.
also feel like Esther kind of grew up before our eyes. Like kind of in the beginning, she was just a young girl who followed her uncle and did what he said. And then as she went to the harem and followed the advice of the eunuch, she kind of grew up and became sort of wise and shrewd in her own way, in terms of how she approached the king and everything.
And she,
Is she actually Persian? Was she Persian? Or was she Jewish?
she was Jewish.
She was Jewish, okay.
Yes, she was Jewish, and that was what her uncle Mordecai reminded her of when she was afraid to go to the king to save her people. She was basically in the closet.
Right.
Yeah, she was in the closet.
But I mean, it's interesting because she not only had good advisors, but she knew to listen to them.
And it's interesting to me that, what does a year of beauty treatment look like or feel like? An entire year of beauty treatments that the harem, those who are coming into the harem had. I mean, some milk treatment or honey or what that might look like. And I would really like to talk about Queen Vashti.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I'm with you with that, Reverend Kathy.
I think Vashti is one of the heroines in this story, even though from some angles she might be vilified for being disobedient. However, what person wants to be pawed over and fawned over by a bunch of drunken people? I mean, laid out on display, come here, let me show you off, and then let my friends paw over you. I'm drunk and my friends are drunk, and we're going to objectify you in this situation. And so she said no and paid the price for it. And the decree that goes out throughout the land, all wives, these people are in charge of their households and they cannot be. But the king regretted it later after he sobered up. And so I was remarked at this rule, what appeared to me to be just a crazy rule that once the king makes a decree, it can never be rescinded.
It sounded
makes sense.
It sounded like it was a tradition. It was sort of the tradition that once, because the way that I read that is that it was a tradition in Persia that once a king sets a decree, it can't be changed. And I'm wondering if it relates similar to, at least how it used to be like in the Catholic Church, that the idea is that the head of this, whether it's a country or a church, is so connected with the divine that they cannot make a mistake. And so if they make a decree, the assumption is that decree stands, because to change it would presume that the first decree may not have been correct. And I'm wondering if that's where that tradition came from.
Could be.
But I mean, we don't even hear about Vashti. She just, goes, I guess, with the concubine.
Fades into the harem.
But
So that's my thought about Vashti.
Anybody, any other thoughts about Vashti? Well, who was Mordecai? What did people think about Mordecai? What kind of person he was? Don't all talk at
Definitely
once.
strong-willed. He was strong-willed. He made up his mind and he did it, no matter the consequences.
Mordecai, I think just by virtue of the fact that he had taken in his niece, and he clearly was an older man, and I think that spoke volumes to him, about him. And I think in terms of his wisdom, like the fact that he would not bow down to Haman, despite, what repercussions might happen. And in fact, Yvonne was saying, he was good to raise her like his own. But I don't know, I just didn't like this idea, and maybe it's just the culture at that time where people are kind of like, well, it's still the culture today if you look at television. The king is looking for a wife, and then everybody sends their daughters, probably grabbing girls off the street, say you're my daughter, so that maybe, and it's just like this whole event around, being chosen to be, the king's wife. And it just seemed that was just as objectifying as what happened to Vashti in terms of wanting to trot her out.
Well, that would be a kind of, negative way to look at how Mordecai basically introduced her or encouraged her to be part of that beauty pageant group. But maybe he already saw more in her and figured, the text up to that point only says that she was beautiful. So we don't really know much about her character or who she is as a person. And but Mordecai knew her, obviously, because he brought her up. And so he must have been aware of who she was character-wise. And I think for him it was probably, not just the way she looked, but also he figured she would be a good queen based on her character. So we don't know that, but I would, make that point that he probably not just, put her among the other women who were running for that spot because she was beautiful. But that's a positive interpretation of that, endeavor.
So what
For queen.
did people think about Haman?
Well, if I could kind of finish what I wanted to say about Mordecai, because we also talked about things that might be considered sexist as well. I didn't mean it quite the way it came out. I wanted to finish to say, but, he stood up to Haman. He stood up for what he believed in, and also ended up being the hero of the story in the end. That people see negative things in him, but he also had a lot of positives in the things that he did. Of course, Haman is the villain of the story in Esther, to me. And every good story has to have a good villain, I guess, who gets what he deserves.
Right. Just a few people from live stream, Yvonne mentioned it was like the Bachelor show. And Phil said, I guess Esther had talents perhaps as a seducer that Mordecai recognized. Maybe he was confident she was gonna, for whatever reason, win the contest. And Yvonne basically also said that Haman was a wicked man, an evil, prejudiced man. And speaking of anti-Semitism, that's what you saw in here. I mean, Haman, when he got angry with Mordecai, it wasn't enough to just retaliate against Mordecai. He's like, he and all of his people need to go. And that's, to me, was what was so powerful about Mordecai's advice to Esther. When Esther was like, the king hasn't called me to his presence, and if I go and he does not, basically grant mercy on me, the penalty is death. And he told her, don't think
right, you're going to be spared.
That you're going to be spared.
A dead woman walking anyway. So
right, and so it kind of reminded me of, in some respects, the Holocaust. Because you're thinking, just like the writer who talked about being silent, and they came for this group and I didn't speak up, and then they came, and so that's what it kind of reminded me of, that she was put in this position, and Mordecai had to remind her, you could be in this position for just this very purpose, and don't think that you're going to be safe if you remain silent.
And also, she was very courageous by saying, well, if I die, I die, and I'll do this then. And her courage to put it all on her own shoulders.
Right. But what did people think about everything coming back on Haman? It was like
everything he wanted happened to somebody else, and everything he tried to put on someone else came back to him. That's just.
Is there a moral to that ultimate story? Well, Phil asked an interesting question. What about King Xerxes? Was he a hero in some respects?
I thought about him as well, especially when the first decree went out, and basically, Haman tried to sweeten the deal by saying, I'll give you a lot of money as well, and this decree will go out, and this is in your best interest, telling the king what's in his best interest, and the king seemed to agree. And he wasn't even interested in the money. That was not an incentive for him. So he said, keep the money, do as you please, basically. And then obviously he does, quite the opposite afterwards. So he does not seem to have very strong values, let's put it that way. He seemed to be easily persuaded, and we don't really know why. And what is, is he like the politician who does what the latest person who advised them, recommended, because they don't really have a strong position on their own, or is there more to him? But I questioned his his character based on that as well.
That's a good point. And the funniest scene that I like is when he goes to the banquet, and then when he realizes everything's coming back to him, he trips and he falls, and King Xerxes like
Walks in right at
Every time I read that, I crack up. So is there anything else, anyone on the phone or live stream who, is there anything else surrounding Esther you think is important for us to talk about before we move on to Job?
There's one point that maybe I didn't realize or I didn't really read as much into as this time, and that is, it's not only that the fate of the Jews changed, they also basically got approval to attack their enemies in retaliation, also in a way that I don't really understand is just in a way I would consider it just. Because it was not just for them to be safe and be saved and saved from persecution. They were basically given a free rein to kill their enemies, and that kind of creates some unease when I read it. I don't really know what the reason for that is, because it's more just being protected. It's actually giving you the authority to also persecute indiscriminately, basically, anyone who you consider your enemy. So that's it is tricky for me, actually.
I got the impression, though, reading it this time, that the people that they attacked were people that were planning to attack them, and because the king couldn't change his original decree to attack the Jews, that he told the Jews, you can attack me, because I also noted that even though they were allowed to, they did not lay hands on the plunder.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That it wasn't like, but it is a curious, different time.
Yeah, I was curious.
So, let's move on in the interest of time to Job. Does anyone want to say who they think, sort of a quick description of Job? Particularly in the beginning? Anyone on the phone?
Well, if I may speak at the risk of being shouted down. But anyway, I love the Job 121, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. That's kind of classic. But in getting into Job, to me, a lot of blaming of the victim, and told him maybe he should pray harder, get it together, cheer up, man, you should be getting over this, and that's the way it is. And talking about his friends talking to him. But one thing that I thought about that I didn't notice before in reading the story, what about the poor 10 kids that got crushed in the house? Nobody mentioned their feelings or what they might have been going through. It was, of course, all about Job, but that's what stood out to me, the blaming of the victim. And then also in reading through Job, it reminded me, even though we haven't gotten there yet, some of the language reminded me a lot of Proverbs. And last but not least, to me, more than anything, Job spoke of the power and the glory of God. Really fine descriptions of God.
Phil basically said Job was a good man, challenged by God and Satan beyond comprehension.
On the blaming part, and that's something I think I read in one of the upper room reflections, and it didn't occur to me last time I read it. That's at the very beginning, is when the three friends first come to Job. They sit with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and they don't speak a word. And often when we encounter people who grieve, we do not know what to say, and I think that was also true for them. And it's interesting that they actually, I mean, it speaks to a lot of compassion when when you just sit with someone, just being present. You're patient for 7 days. You're not just sitting a couple minutes, an hour or two. It's an extended period of time, and I found that very interesting, especially what you, Rose, said on blaming the victim, because I think they spoke out of compassion. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sit with him for that long. That's at least how I understand it now. And it didn't really occur to me the first time I read it.
Interesting. I know,
That's true. They did sit in silence for 7 days, but it seemed to me once they spoke up, they really kind of jumped in his world. They began to jump in his world a little bit, I guess. That's what I got from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yvonne on live stream said, Job reminds me so much of people today when they feel like bad people have it good, and if you are trying to live a righteous life, you go through bad times. And Phil said, I thought much of Job reminded me of Ecclesiastes. Because it's sort of, good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. And I think part of this, to me, was the struggle. Because like everything we read so far, it was sort of like bad things happen because you did something wrong.
Exactly.
And it seemed like that's what they were struggling with. So I actually, this time, I didn't feel so bad about his friends because they're going by what they had been taught. And this time I was a little irritated with Job because I'm thinking, despite the setup, nobody is perfect. And it was sort of like, I'm a perfect person, so why is this happening? You know what I mean? So it kind of went both ways. You could kind of see both sides. But what did, go ahead.
I think, well, and for me, in this time, it helped me to see that so often, like you said, there's this transactional nature that we have with sin and bad stuff, or with doing bad stuff because I sinned, or I'm having a hard time because God's punishing me for whatever reason because I sinned. And this whole book to me dispenses with that notion. And like you said, challenging stuff and bad stuff happens to people, good, bad, indifferent. And so it's not transactional, it's not causative, it's not you did this, so this happened to you. And so a lesson for us and a lesson for the people at the time could be that someone's going through a bad or hard time, it's not necessarily because there's sin in their life. It happens. And so I enjoyed toward the end where God is said to have said, Job, brace yourself and answer me like a man.
Right.
And when you're faced with the God of creation saying, okay, brace up and I'm going to send some stuff your way, it's hard not to just wilt in the face of that, I think. So
the live stream people are having a very lively discussion here.
Okay.
A Billy was saying, reading about Job has given me strength to endure my own woes. Lila, who got, she's now on live stream. She said, I found it interesting that Job cursed the day he was born. It suggested that he also struggled at times with wondering why God cursed him initially. And good things happen to bad people. And a number of people resonated with Phil's comment with Ecclesiastes, sort of, bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. But what do people think about the setup? Like, this is the first time where there's some in-depth interaction between God, and then Satan appears out of nowhere, when amongst the angels coming, and then they have this whole conversation. Why do you think that setup is there? Reverend Kathy, you are probably the person in class who always had her hand up.
Yes.
Right, for those on live stream on the phone, I can tell Reverend Kathy is like itching to say something.
And I'm allowing others space to say something. I don't have to be first to market all the time, so.
Pastor, any thoughts?
Well, not so much about the setup. I think what we're seeing here is that oftentimes it's kind of what Reverend Kathy was saying about the transactional stuff, that oftentimes we have an outcome-based faith, an approach to faith, and that this is less about, the outcomes can be all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And what I see as the thread that goes from beginning to end is the importance of staying in the conversation, period, beyond the outcomes, and the tenacity of the conversation. And so it's starting to move, even though there's a lot of the sort of black-white stuff going on here. It's actually a movement beginning to turn that on its head. Mm-hmm. It's putting that. I think it's actually kind of also starting to lay some of the groundwork around the suffering that ultimately becomes also the suffering of Christ. It starts to raise some of those questions. What is suffering, and is suffering really about our own egos and the meaning we make of it, or is it more about something that is connective on a deeper level? That's beyond anyone's individual ego. That's making some sense.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I actually saw, I think I put this in the email, some things that kind of seem like they would lead toward Christ.
Mm-hmm.
From, will the ox stand by your manger at night? And I just thought that was a very curious
Mm-hmm.
phrase in Job. And then other things I noted, like in Job 19, it talks about, I wrote in the corners and I underlined, Redeemer lives.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another, in chapter 16, Job talked about my advocate on high, my intercessor. I noted those things because they just seem to suggest, kind of a foreshadowing.
Yes.
For Jesus.
And I don't know if it was taken from this book or someone else quoting this, but this is the song that's in Handel's Messiah. This is the.
Which one?
I know that Job 19:25. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth.
Yeah.
And so the second half of the Messiah. So that text was taken from all over the Bible, and so this is probably where it came from. And I was smiling because when you asked about kind of the interaction between God and others at the beginning, and the kind of the setup for what happens later, to me, I smile because I think my view is probably different from everyone else's, in that I think the writers are trying to explain, if you agree that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, and that it's not necessarily because of sin, then there has to be some other explanation for why this stuff happens. And so, to me, the writers then back it up to go, well, if it's not here, then let's look over here. What might have been happening in heaven with God talking to the angels and Satan? What might this conversation have looked like? And boom, you have this literature that puts God basically saying, hey, there's some righteous people on earth. Take a look at that one. So,
Right.
that's my thought.
And,
And it's different.
hello.
Hey, no, come on in.
And,
I thought he was down there, but let me see if I can track down.
And Billy pointed out, Rose pointed out that she thinks I think she's right, this may only be the second reference to Satan so far, which might feed into, that thought that this was written as kind of an explanation, trying to explain why bad things happen to good people. But yeah, I think someone said earlier that, yeah, it's a shame because no one talks about the 10 children that were killed, up front. And, to me, you can't really replace people. And so even at the end, when he gets more children, it doesn't speak
he
to
doesn't
the
have
prior.
it all.
Yeah.
No, he doesn't get it all back. Because no parent, I know this firsthand, no parent should lose a child. And so that's kind of, it sticks throughout. And my heart really goes out to Job's wife. Even though she is frustrated to the point of saying, Job, so much stuff has happened to you and I don't really understand it. Maybe it's just time for you to just curse God and die. Just die. I have been to that point of frustration where I don't get it. I'm at the end of my rope. And so my heart goes out to her in her relationship to Job because, in my view, she doesn't know what else to say to him.
Right.
So.
Well, I do find it interesting talking about women, because I like to point out women in the Bible, is that at the very end, I thought it was curious that they note that Job granted his daughters an inheritance along with his sons. It's just like, even if he had done that, like, why was that even, mentioned? I thought was curious.
Mm-hmm.
So we were finishing up with Job. Do you have any burning questions or comments about Job before we move on to Psalms? Not fine.
Well, I
Okay.
don't
That's all right.
know what to discuss that already now, so kind of hard to. I think the thing that was always very strong about Job, and I'm saying it probably from King James translation, is talk about though you slay me, yet will I trust you, and that was a part of what Job was doing. Even though he also was blaming Satan for his own conduct, even though his friends were saying you must have done something wrong. And yet, basically, it was all said and done, God blamed all of them. Look, where were you when I did all these things, different things? So, but the joke of saying that though you slay me, if God is doing it, if you're slaying me, I'm still going to trust you. And that was one of the strongest things for me in Job. If you're doing it, I'm still going to trust you.
One thing that I just wanted to point out, I started seeing in Job and I think somewhere in Psalm. This is sort of the science side of me, but I started reading more into things like in Job 38, where God says, "Can you bind the chains of Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of heaven?" And this reading, I read it as, do you know physics? Do you know? I read that as a scientific reference this time, that it was not referring to the moral laws or it's the basic laws of physics, the laws of science. Do you even know that? It's like the answer is no.
But I like what you said because I never thought of it in that context. I just looked at it and had looked at it before that basically God was saying that you don't really know who I am. You know, I've done all these things. So where are you when I did the foundation? Where were you when I started this whole process? You know, and then begin to renew all the other things that was happening. He said, but basically, where were you? You know, and you're talking to me and making this accusation. You don't know what I've done.
Well, it's interesting because the people in Washington have been having a very interesting conversation. So if I see, I won't get into all of everything, but to close out Job, they were having a back and forth about the existence of Satan. They were having a back and forth about whether Satan was just a construct, for the purposes of this story. Those that believe in Satan's existence talked about, well, why would God give in to Satan? So they're having a very lively discussion. We don't have a lot of time, to focus in on that, but those are some very, interesting, because we kind of talked about the opening part of Job and whether, what was the significance of that, and there were different views on whether Reverend Kathy made it a good point, saying, it's the ongoing struggle between why do bad things happen to good people, and it was maybe the writer's way of explaining that, as opposed to necessarily taking it literally, and others on live stream have some different views, but it's an interesting thing to, contemplate.
It speaks to Pastor's sermon this past week that you always have those questions that are unanswerable, and trying to take it to God or blame God or ask for those types of questions are
right.
Something that you just need to redirect or think in different terms than that, I guess.
It's an interesting story that I believe Charles Darwin walked around with a copy of, what book was that? It was a religious book. If I can't remember it, I'll email everyone. But it was a book written about this, trying to explain why do bad things happen to good people. It's a famous book, and I'm completely forgetting what it is. But it was interesting because one of the things that I read was that led to Charles Darwin's work was that he was struggling with the evil in nature, and why if there was a God, why even in nature there seemed to be waste, there seemed to be things that seemed cruel or what have you, and that kind of Paradise Lost.
Well, yeah.
Yes, yes. So,
I have just one
Sure.
other alibi. In Job 25, where Bildad is talking, and I just want to make a theological point here because I see it a lot, and Reverend Dwayne sees it a lot, and we actually talk about it a lot. Starting with verse 4, how can a man be righteous before God? How can one born of a woman be pure, even if the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes? How much less man who is but a maggot, a son of man who is only a worm? And I implore all of us to understand that shame and worminess and feeling that one might be a maggot before God is not of God.
No, it's correct.
It's not it's not good theology, and it's not good faith. God does not wish us to be shamed or feel ourselves to be wormy maggots. God created us in God's image and gave us God's breath. And so I encourage each of us to, as much as possible, to lay aside the shame and stomp on the worm and the maggot.
Well, I think it's,
Reverend Kathy, can you repeat what verse you're referencing in that?
Verses 4 and 5.
Okay.
Job
Thank you
25.
for that. I appreciate that.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
So in the last bit, we'll start on Psalms. I wasn't too stressed about rushing the Psalms because we'll probably pick up with finishing Psalms next week. But with Psalms, really, I sent an email out about how there's believed to be various writers of each of the Psalms. Some of them seem to have more clearer attribution. There's actually one that they think was put in that was written by Moses. Yes. I think that was Psalm 90. But I mean, and obviously reading through this, you could see that there's a lot of songs today that were inspired by many of these. But were there any particular songs that stuck out for anyone? I mean,
I wanted to say, because it was interesting when I was reading it last night. You could tell the songs that David wrote because it was always, even though he was aware of his sin, but that he was going to stand with God. And some of the other ones, you're going to talk about retribution. They were more focused on revenge. They're standing on what the God is truth, but they were more revengeful in their. And to me, now maybe I'm wrong about it, but I could tell the author's change because the focus of David was a little different than what some of the other writers in Psalms were about. Maybe that's what I thought. Could you tell a distinct difference?
I don't know, because I think David wrote a whole wide variety of psalms and songs. When he was running from Saul.
Right.
So I don't know. I'd have to take a look at that.
I think when in here it shows you when it says that this is the last song that David wrote.
Right.
And then you change voice, change tones.
Right.
And I'm saying I've never noticed. And I knew that several people wrote those songs, but I never noticed that distinctiveness. How his stuff was more, to me, said to be still more merciful, more standing God. God. No matter what's happening with me, please deliver me. And then, I want you to do my enemy. But the other part of it is still bring Israel out and proclaim your name. But the other is there was more. It seemed like there was more of judgment.
Right. I kind of got a sense of the different styles as well, and David would have a way of praising God, but then calling down curses on his enemies. up on that as well. I think I put in the email as well that this is not listed as one of the prophetic books, but I think when we hit the New Testament, one thing that I noticed in the past is that some of the things quoted as prophecy are actually from Psalms. So, so should Psalms actually be, listed as a prophetic book, or, just I don't know, but it's
or
just
a convenient source document.
a convenient source document. Well, it just seems like there's some will not let my faithful seed decay.
And it's, a lot of people that's talking about Jesus. So he's talking about his soul should not seek corruption.
Right.
That's why the issue of him rising in 3 days, because the fourth day is considered to be corruption. So there's a lot of prophetic stuff in the Psalms, I believe, that talk about Christ.
Right. Pierce hands and feet and cast lots for clothes.
As you see in retrospect,
Right.
right? So
We
someone
could
took
have
a breath. Someone took a breath.
Well, we have Rose saying, Rose loves the Psalms. Lila's favorite one is Psalm 23 because she's heard it so many times. Rose lists a whole gaggle of them that are her favorite ones. And Rose also asked, please explain what you mean by, I think she means acrostic psalms. She wrote acoustic. Acrostic. So the way that I understand those is that if you take the Hebrew alphabet, that each line starts in alphabetical order with the next, it's almost like take that English alphabet, the first line would start with the A, or a syllable, starting with the A, and then the next line would start with a B, and the next line C. So those poems and psalms are written in that way, but using the Hebrew alphabet. But we would know because it's translated into English. So there's a few more minutes. Reverend Kathy has her hand up.
One of the things that I really appreciated was seeing the thread of unfailing love and seeing the words unfailing love throughout many of the Psalms. What I particularly enjoyed was the direction to the choir director and the musicians. So, sung to the tune of a shigan. Well, wow, I wish I knew what a shigan was, and I wish I knew what it sounded like, but clearly whoever was leading the band here knew what it was. And so there are so many directions given to the musicians and the singers of how to sing, what to sing, and what tune to sing things in. I found very exciting when it comes up.
Yeah, and Reverend Kathy, I agree with that. And I wasn't around for last week's class, but if I might just interject a little bit, one of the things I got from reading Chronicles and all of that was the importance of music in worship and in the service and the order of service, because so much attention was given to the musicians that they were actually noted, and that was a specific job. And then when you tie it into what you just said about Psalms, it just drives home to me the importance of music as being part of the worship service. I don't know if you guys discussed that last week, but
We talked about it last week.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, from beginning to end, music it's in really all the books on some level.
Yeah.
And one of the thoughts, I see the Psalms really as influencing all the other sections in the Bible, because it was the songs that they sang around the campfire at night. It's the songs they sang while creating their story, and they developed over time. So you're going to see the Psalms and the prophets, because the prophets, when they were walking the dusty roads, they were singing the songs they learned as children. So it's not that the prophets end up in the Psalms end up in the prophets.
Amen. Yeah.
And I think we'll see that Jesus most likely had the Psalms completely memorized, and it was his songbook as well.
But what's interesting though, because about David, who wrote this, one reason why David was able to soothe, was called into Saul, because his music calmed his spirit. David had the anointing, but music, so when Saul's spirit was upset, they sent for David to play, and it would soothe his spirit. So,
and even the ones attributed to David were not really original to David, because he was at that point taking the songs he'd learned growing up, and then was transforming them in his own way. They went through his lens, but none of it was original to him. It was what he had sung growing up, and so really they are born from the heart of community, as opposed to any individual, and it comes all the way through.
Well, thank you. It is just about 8 o'clock, and I encourage you, because one thing that I did last week, and maybe it's just because I'm looking at the live stream and all this and that, is that I actually listened to the discussion after, and I'm like, oh. And I mean, there was stuff that I guess hadn't sunk in when I was here. So I mean, consider doing that, and just keep reading. I mean, it seems like even folks that are a little bit behind are still keeping up. I encourage everyone to keep reading, encourage all the people on live stream to keep reading, and again, feel free if there are burning issues and questions during the week, just email them to me and I'll send them out to the group, to see if there's any feedback. So is there anything else?
Yes, I Googled Esther movies, and I think we should celebrate when we get through the B90. We should have an Esther party.
Oh.
And but there was Esther and the King, 1960. With Joan Collins playing Esther.
Oh, wow.
So that could be fun. There was a 2013 book of Esther. There's one called Such a Time as This. And there's another one that sounds kind of juicy called One Night with the King.
Whoa.
Well, it's interesting because there is a song called Esther. It's a more contemporary song. I think, was it from... forget I don't want to say the wrong artist, but it has a prominent cello part.
Let's see, remember it.
But the message is so specific, it just seems like it would be out of place unless it's done in coordination with a message from Esther.
Yeah.
Because
Is
otherwise,
that the context?
because otherwise, I think, so not putting that out there.
Yeah, it could be fun. There are some casting issues because Esther in this, she looks like she's from Sweden in this particular picture here. So, they've got some casting issues. That could be a fun way to celebrate.
Joan Collins.
So does anyone want to close us out in prayer?
Oh, mercy.
Anyone want to close us out in prayer? I'll pray. Heavenly God, thank you. Thank you for this evening. Thank you for bringing us together and allowing us to discuss what we've been reading. We ask that you open our hearts to you. Open our hearts to what you want each of us to learn and take away from this experience. That you guide us in all that we do. Watch over us and bless us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
See you live stream, folks.